I never imagined that a simple family dinner could shatter everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the son I raised with my own hands. That evening began like any other, with me standing in my kitchen, carefully preparing my son's favorite meal. I had spent hours cooking, hoping this dinner would soften the growing distance between us. Ever since his marriage, I felt myself slowly pushed to the edges of his life, like an old photograph no one wanted to look at anymore. When they arrived, my son barely hugged me. His wife smiled, but her eyes were cold, calculating, as if she were already annoyed by my presence in my own home. I ignored the discomfort and tried to keep the conversation light. I asked about their work, their plans, their future. Every question was answered briefly, without warmth. As we sat down to eat, the tension thickened. I mentioned, gently, that I was thinking of selling my house. The upkeep was becoming too much, and I wanted something smaller, something peaceful. I also added that I planned to use part of the money to finally travel, something I had postponed for decades while raising my son alone after his father passed away. That's when everything changed. My son slammed his fork down and looked at me with anger I had never seen before. "You're being selfish," he said loudly. The words hit me harder than a slap. I stared at him, stunned. Selfish, for wanting a quiet life after years of sacrifice. Selfish, for daring to think of myself. Before I could even respond, his wife laughed sharply. "Exactly," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Do you know how that money could help us? We're trying to build our future, and you're thinking about vacations." My heart pounded. I reminded them calmly that this house was bought with my savings, my long nights, my missed opportunities. I never asked them for anything. I only wanted understanding. But understanding never came. My son stood up, pointing his finger at me. "You always think you're the victim," he snapped. "If you really cared about us, you'd help us instead of wasting money on yourself." That was the moment something inside me broke. Before I could process his words, his wife suddenly stood, lifted her glass, and without hesitation threw red wine directly at my face. It splashed across my hair, my clothes, dripping down onto the floor I had cleaned just hours earlier. The room went silent. I could taste the bitterness, not just of the wine, but of betrayal. My son didn't stop her. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look shocked. He just stood there, silent, as if I somehow deserved it. I walked slowly to the bathroom, washed my face, and stared at my reflection. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My hands were shaking, but my mind was suddenly very clear. This wasn't just disrespect. This was abuse. When I returned to the dining room, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my phone, typed one short message, and sent it. "I need to talk, urgently." It was to my lawyer. My son scoffed when he saw me texting. "What are you doing now?" he asked sarcastically. "I'm protecting myself," I replied quietly. His wife rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." But deep inside, I knew this was no drama. This was survival. I told them to leave. For the first time in my life, I asked my own child to walk out of my house. They left without another word, slamming the door behind them. That night, I barely slept. Memories flooded my mind, working double shifts, skipping meals so my son could have better clothes, better education, a better life. I remembered defending him, supporting him, forgiving his mistakes again and again. And yet, there I was, alone, soaked in wine and heartbreak. The next morning, my lawyer called back. I explained everything. The pressure, the entitlement, the threats, the emotional manipulation. He listened carefully and then said something that changed everything. "You have every right to protect your assets and your peace." That sentence gave me strength. I began documenting everything. Messages, calls, past incidents I had ignored. I realized this wasn't sudden, it had been building for years. My kindness had been mistaken for weakness. This was only the beginning. I didn't know yet how far I would have to go, or how much it would cost emotionally, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never allow anyone, family or not, to humiliate me again. And that dinner, the wine, the words, "You're being selfish," they were the moment I finally chose myself. The days after that dinner felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. My phone stayed silent at first, and that silence hurt more than any argument. No apology, no explanation, just nothing. For years, I had been the one to call first, to fix things, to smooth over pain. This time, I didn't move. I waited. 3 days later, the messages started. At first, they were polite. My son asked if we could talk calmly. His wife sent a short message saying things had gotten out of hand. Not once did either of them mention the wine, the insults, or the humiliation. Not once did they say sorry. I read every word carefully, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Something inside me had shifted. When my lawyer finally met me in person, he listened without interrupting. I told him everything, how my son had changed, how financial pressure had slowly turned into expectation, then entitlement. I explained how his wife had begun speaking to me as if my life belonged to them. When I finished, my hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. He leaned back and said quietly, "You're not alone. I see this more often than you think." Those words mattered. They made me realize this wasn't a personal failure. It was a pattern. He explained my rights clearly. The house was mine, my savings were mine, my future was mine. No one, child or spouse, had any legal claim unless I allowed it. For years, fear had kept me silent. Fear of losing my son. Fear of being alone. Fear of being judged. That fear had cost me my dignity. That week, I changed my will. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of protection. When my son found out, he exploded. He called me repeatedly, his voice full of anger and disbelief. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded. "After everything," I asked him calmly, "after everything I did for you, or everything you think I still owe you?" There was a long pause. He had no answer. Then his wife took over the calls. Her tone was sharper, colder. She accused me of manipulation, of tearing the family apart, of choosing money over blood. I listened quietly and then said something I had never said before. I chose respect. That ended the conversation. Days turned into weeks. I started noticing how peaceful my home felt without constant tension. I slept better. I ate better. I even laughed again, something I hadn't done freely in years. For the first time, I realized how much emotional weight I had been carrying just to keep everyone else comfortable. Then came the formal letter. They were contesting my decisions, claiming emotional distress, claiming I had been influenced, claiming I was unstable. When my lawyer showed me the document, I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but it passed quickly. I had prepared for this. We responded with evidence, messages, witness statements, financial records. Truth has a way of standing firm when lies collapse under pressure. When my son finally agreed to meet, it wasn't in my home. It was in a neutral place, with boundaries clearly set. He looked tired, older somehow. The anger was gone, replaced by frustration and confusion. "I don't understand why you changed," he said. I looked at him and realized something painful and freeing at the same time. I hadn't changed. I had simply stopped pretending. "I raised you to be strong," I said softly. "Not to control others, not to humiliate them, and not to stay silent when they're hurt." He looked down. For a moment, I saw the child I once knew. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and the wall returned. "I hope you don't regret this," he said before leaving. I watched him walk away without chasing him. That was the hardest part. But also the most powerful. Months later, the legal matter was resolved quietly. No court drama, no public scenes, just clear decisions and clear consequences. My lawyer smiled when it ended and said, "You stood your ground." I sold the house. I moved to a smaller place filled with light and silence and peace. I traveled for the first time without guilt. I met people who saw me as a person, not a resource. I learned that being a parent doesn't mean sacrificing your self-worth forever. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about my son. I miss him, but I no longer miss who I had to become to keep him close. That dinner, those words, "You're being selfish," and the wine on my face were not the end of my family. They were the beginning of my freedom.